If you live somewhere the cable company never bothered to run a line, there's a decent chance you have paid one particular company every month for years without ever learning its name. At the end of 2020, it had 1.5 million broadband subscribers like that. By this March, it had 681,000. By the end of June, the most recent count before the bankruptcy filing, that number was down to 622,000, 59,000 subscribers lost in that quarter alone. That's the slow motion loss of most of a customer base built over decades, in a business whose entire pitch was that customers had nowhere else to go. And on top of that number, the bill still came due. On August 3rd, 2026, a company called Hughes Satellite Systems Corporation and its operating arm, Hughes Network Systems, told a bankruptcy court in Houston that it did not have the cash or committed financing to cover $1.5 billion in bonds that had matured 2 days earlier, and asked the court for permission to reorganize. Here's why owning that business looked, for decades, like the safest bet available. Picture a ranch in eastern Montana or a fishing village on the coast of Alaska. No fiber crew is running cable out there. No cellular carrier is putting up a tower for 40 potential customers spread across 200 square miles. In a lot of places like that, a dish on the roof or staked in the yard wasn't an upgrade. It was often the only realistic way onto the internet, at any price you could name. Where you were the one company willing to point a satellite at a place like that, you had about as little competition for that customer as a business ever gets. Add up enough of those customers across enough rural counties and continents, and you have built something that functions like a monopoly. For a long time, it basically was one. And this particular company earned that position the hard way. Over more than 50 years, which is part of why the ending lands so strangely. Hughes traces back to 1971, when 7 engineers and a lawyer left a research lab, pooled $40,000, and started designing circuit boards for telecom equipment out of a garage in Rockville, Maryland. By the late 1970s, they had grown into a real satellite technology company. And in 1985, they developed and brought to market something called the VSAT, a small, affordable satellite dish that let a business connect a remote location without laying a single wire. Their first customer for that invention was Walmart, which used it to link up stores in rural towns the phone network barely reached. That founding idea, solving distance with a dish instead of a wire, is what every later version of the company was still selling 40 years on. EchoStar bought the whole operation, by then renamed Hughes Communications in 2011, and kept building on that same foundation. Sounds simple. It is not, because the thing you actually own when you own a satellite internet business is not really a customer list. It is a piece of hardware sitting in a fixed orbital slot, more than 22,000 miles from the ground. And that number is about to matter more than anything else in this story. Start with what building that business requires, because it explains why it looked bulletproof for so long. A geostationary communication satellite, the kind Hughes flies, cost somewhere in the low hundreds of millions of dollars to build. Before you even pay to launch it on a rocket, insure it, and build the ground stations that talk to it. Design, manufacturing, testing, and launch typically take years from contract signature to the satellite actually reaching orbit, and there is no reliable way to speed that up once the order is placed. Once it gets there, it sits in a fixed slot above a fixed point on the equator, orbiting at exactly the speed the Earth rotates, so a dish bolted to your roof never has to move to track it across the sky. That fixed position is the entire business model. A single satellite can beam a signal down to an enormous footprint, sometimes covering most of a continent. From one piece of hardware you never have to touch again. It is also, without anyone designing it this way on purpose, the cage the whole business eventually sits inside. A satellite like that launches with a fixed amount of bandwidth, decided the day the manufacturing was finished. You cannot upgrade it in orbit. You cannot add capacity to it next year because demand grew. Whatever throughput it launched with is the throughput it has for its entire operating life, typically around 15 years, until you build and launch a replacement that takes just as long and costs just as much all over again. Hughes actually tried exactly that play. In 2012, it rolled out an upgraded ground and satellite platform called Jupiter, and its newest and largest satellite under that program entered commercial service in December of 2023. One of the biggest communications satellites the company had ever put into orbit. That satellite was meant to be the counterpunch. Just over 2.5 years after it came fully online, the satellite subsidiary was in bankruptcy court anyway. Owning the best version of an aging kind of asset is still owning an aging kind of asset. There is also a physical tax built into that distance that no amount of clever engineering removes. And it's worth doing the math, because 22,000 miles doesn't sound like much until you convert it into time. A signal traveling at the speed of light takes about 1/10 of a second just to reach the satellite. About the same again to come back down to a ground station. And then the whole trip has to repeat once more before a reply gets back to you. Add it up, and you get a round-trip travel distance of nearly 90,000 miles, packed into roughly half a second once you include the equipment doing the processing along the way. That's fine for loading a web page. It is close to unusable for a video call, brutal for online gaming, and it was never going to get better because the distance itself is the delay. You cannot engineer your way out of nearly 90,000 miles of round trip. For most of the history of this industry, that half-second lag simply did not matter, because there was no competing product to measure it against. That changed. Starting a little over a decade ago, a different kind of satellite company decided to stop fighting the distance and instead eliminate it. Instead of a handful of enormously expensive satellites parked 22,000 miles up, put thousands of comparatively cheap ones in low orbit, roughly 340 miles up, something like 65 times closer to the ground. SpaceX built exactly that constellation under the name Starlink, launching its first working satellites in 2019. And by the middle of this year, it had reportedly passed 12 million customers across 160 countries. Amazon has been racing to stand up a comparable network of its own, a constellation it now calls LEO after years of calling it Project Kuiper, planned at more than 3,000 satellites, right behind it. That thousands of satellites approach is not just a marketing choice, it is a direct consequence of flying low. A satellite 340 miles up moves fast, relative to the ground beneath it, and only stays over any one patch of sky for a few minutes at a time. So no single one of them can sit over your house the way a geostationary satellite does. The only way to keep a customer connected as each satellite races out of range is to have another one already sliding into position to take over, which means covering the whole globe continuously takes a constantly rotating fleet of thousands of cheap satellites instead of one expensive one. Hughes had built its entire company on one enormous, expensive, long-lived bet. The market had just decided that thousands of small, disposable ones worked better. None of this was subtle to the actual subscribers sitting at home. A single geostationary satellite spreads one fixed pool of bandwidth across every customer in its footprint, which for years meant HughesNet plans built around a monthly data allowance. Use it up, and your connection got dramatically slower for whatever was left of the month, no matter how much you were paying. A constellation of thousands of low satellites, by contrast, can keep adding raw capacity to a region simply by launching more hardware into it, which is a large part of how Starlink could sell a flatter, faster, far less rationed product into the exact same rural map Hughes had spent decades treating as its own. The comparison a customer makes at that point is not complicated, capped and laggy against fast and effectively unlimited. A satellite that close removes most of the geostationary lag, and because the satellites are mass-produced on an assembly line rather than custom-built one at a time over years, the company launching them can keep adding capacity every few months instead of waiting 15 years to replace one aging bird. That is the trap sitting quietly inside the old kind of asset. Hughes could not respond to a faster, cheaper competitor by building a faster, cheaper satellite, because that is simply not how geostationary hardware works. Its entire orbiting fleet, Jupiter included, was locked into the physics and the economics it launched with. The only lever left to pull was price, and price alone was never going to be enough once a genuinely faster product started showing up in the same rural driveways Hughes had spent 50 years treating as safely captured. The company's own leadership said as much in public nearly a year before any of this reached a courtroom. An EchoStar executive admitted outright that SpaceX was, in his words, the undisputed leader in satellite internet. Coming from a rival, that line would be marketing. Coming from Hughes' own parent company a full year before the bankruptcy, it was a concession, and conceding the argument didn't put a single satellite back into a better orbit. So look at what actually happened once that faster product existed. In the sworn declaration, Hughes' own chief restructuring officer, Robert Del Genio, Filed with the bankruptcy court, the company disclosed that its broadband subscriber base fell about 21.5% in just the 12 months ending in June of last year. Del Hanio did not describe that as a rough patch that would pass. The court filing states it plainly. The company does not expect this trend to reverse because, in Del Hanio's words, LEO satellite competition is structural, not cyclical. And the company's competitors continue to expand coverage and reduce costs. Translated out of the legal caution, that filing is the company itself admitting. It built this business on being the only option. It no longer is. And nothing in its own numbers suggests that changes. Now the collapse itself, because the sequence is worth laying out precisely. Hughes Satellite Systems Corporation and its operating arm, Hughes Network Systems, filed voluntary Chapter 11 petitions on the 3rd of August. The case landed in the Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of Texas in Houston. The filing covers the satellite broadband business specifically. It does not touch EchoStar Corporation, the parent company that actually owns Hughes. EchoStar's other consumer brands, Dish TV, Sling TV, and Boost Mobile, sit entirely outside the case. Hughes-owned subsidiaries outside the United States aren't part of it either. What went into court was the rural satellite internet business itself, carved out and kept legally separate from everything else the wider corporate family runs. The trigger was almost mechanically simple, once you see the numbers side by side. $1.5 billion in senior notes matured on August 1st. As of the end of March, the company's own financial disclosures put its cash on hand at roughly $102 million. That works out to about 7 cents on hand for every dollar it owed, 2 days before the payment was due. The filing was simply the predictable result of that math, arriving right on schedule. Here is where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the people actually getting hurt by this are not who a headline like "Satellite Company Goes Bankrupt" would suggest. Court filings show the company laid off 400 employees the same week it filed. Out of 1,275 people total, roughly a third of everyone who worked there gone in a single announcement. Those layoffs fell on the technicians who drove out to bolt dishes onto rural roofs, the call center staff who talked to confused customers through a router reset, and the warehouse workers who kept replacement equipment moving, not on the executives who made the strategic calls that led here. Small suppliers and rural service contractors that install and maintain that equipment don't come out ahead either. Unsecured creditors like them typically face a long wait and a partial recovery at best, once the court works out who gets paid and in what order. And underneath all of that, a group of bondholders holding roughly 80% of Hughes's senior debt sent the company a letter on July 21st, before the Chapter 11 petition even existed, accusing it of fraudulent transfers and breaches of fiduciary duty and how money had moved through the corporate structure in the run-up to the filing. Fraudulent transfer claims like that one typically argue that money moved out to insiders or affiliated entities, while a company could still see its own insolvency coming, leaving less behind for the creditors waiting in line once it actually filed. Del Hanio, on the company's behalf, has rejected those accusations as without merit, and none of it has been decided by a court. But the fact that Hughes' own largest creditors were making that accusation in writing before the bankruptcy petition's ink was even dry tells you the run-up to this filing was contentious, not some quiet, cooperative wind-down. Meanwhile, the parent company's own results tell a very different story. EchoStar reported its second quarter results the very same week Hughes filed. Revenue came in at roughly $3.5 billion. Net income was $8.46 billion, against a net loss of just $306,000 in the same quarter a year earlier. That swing follows a run of asset sales, including wireless spectrum licenses. EchoStar sold off to larger telecom and space players for more than $40 billion combined in cash and stock. Deals that padded the parent company's balance sheet considerably. None of that appears to have gone toward covering Hughes's notes. The debt at the satellite subsidiary sat legally separate from the rest of the corporate family well before it came due, which is part of why a subsidiary carrying $1.5 billion of unpaid notes could be one legal signature away from a parent company posting a multi-billion-dollar profit in the very same earnings call. It also was not even EchoStar's first bankruptcy filing this year. Back in late June, separate EchoStar entities tied to its satellite television service and to an abandoned wireless network build-out had already filed their own unrelated Chapter 11 case in that same Houston courthouse as part of a prearranged restructuring. Hughes is a different filing, with a different balance sheet and a different set of problems. But two Chapter 11 cases out of the same corporate parent inside of 5 weeks is not the kind of thing anyone should wave off as ordinary business churn. And it is hard to miss that both cases share the same underlying shape. Enormous years-in-the-making infrastructure built to own a piece of ground nobody else wanted to compete for, made obsolete by a rival willing to build something more flexible instead. The wireless network chased spectrum and towers. Hughes chased orbital slots. In both cases, somebody else made the physical asset replaceable. So, what happens now to the satellites themselves? Hughes says it intends to keep operating through the bankruptcy process and has pointed the court toward a different future entirely. Enterprise, government, and defense contracts, where it says it already has about $1.5 billion of business under contract, plus new agreements with airline and United States defense customers. Notice that figure. It's the same number, coincidentally, as the debt that just sank the residential side of the business, though it describes something entirely different: contracted future revenue that still has to be delivered and collected, not a debt that already came due and went unpaid. The old bet was hardware bought years ago for customers who mostly already left. The new one is a wager that a different kind of customer, needing coverage independent of any single ground-based network for reasons of national security or continuity of operations, will keep paying a premium for exactly the thing that stopped working as a consumer pitch, being the option nobody else can offer. That bet is not crazy on its face. A defense agency moving troops through a region with no reliable ground network, or an airline keeping passengers connected over open ocean, cares less about shaving a few hundred milliseconds off a video call and more about a dedicated link that a rival government or a single commercial rival cannot simply price you out of or reroute around. Those customers also sign multi-year contracts instead of month-to-month plans, and they rarely churn the moment a faster consumer product shows up in a Facebook ad. Geostationary capacity, reserved and contracted, rather than shared with millions of residential customers, still has a real market. It is just a much smaller and much more specialized one than the rural broadband business Hughes actually built its balance sheet on. Here is the lesson worth actually taking out of this. Owning rural satellite infrastructure looked for decades like owning a fortress. Enormous cost of entry, a captive customer base, geography doing the competitive protection work for you so thoroughly that a company founded in a garage in 1971 could still be the only name in the market 50 years later. Through repackagings, ownership changes, and at least one full corporate rename. What that pitch never priced in is what happens the day geography stops being a moat. The day somebody else works out how to solve the same distance problem with cheaper, mass-produced hardware that keeps getting better every few months instead of every 15 years. Nobody stormed that fortress. Subscribers just walked away from it, one household at a time, until the number that used to prove Hughes was unstoppable was the same number proving it never had been. A business built in a garage in 1971 to solve the exact problem of connecting places nobody else would reach ended up on the losing side of somebody else solving that same problem better. Here's what I'm actually curious about. Is a dish still bolted to your roof right now because it's genuinely your only option, or did something faster already reach you first? Put it in the comments and I read all of them.